Ethan woke before the light, the kind of waking that felt like surfacing from a lake too cold to welcome him back. The barn breathed around him, hay and iron and old wood, and somewhere nearby the hay horse shifted, a sound like a question left unanswered. Ethan lay still, counting his breaths, aware of the thinness of his resolve. He had stayed through the night, and staying was already more than he had promised himself. The hay horse stood tethered loosely now, no wire biting its skin, only a rope slack enough to allow a choice. Ethan had learned, in the small hours, that trust arrived better when it was invited. The enamel's coat was a mat of winter survived, scars like peeled camel's where Pin had paused and moved on. When the hay horse lifted its head, Ethan felt seen without being judged, and that unsettled him more than the fear had. He rose slowly, careful with his weight, careful with the space between them. His boots whispered across the dirt. He poured water into a dented trough, the splash echoing, and placed a flake of hay where the hay horse could decide to approach. He did not reach out. He waited, hands open, a posture he had forgotten how to hold. Outside, the morning pressed its face to the barn slats, grey and patient. The hay horse did not rush. It sniffed, paused, then stepped forward with the caution of someone who had learned what sudden movements could cost. Ethan's chest tightened as the enamel ate, each bite a small mercy. He noticed how the hay horse chewed slowly, as if savoring survival itself. Ethan sat on an upturned bucket, the cold seeping through denim, and watched. He felt the hours rearrange themselves around this quiet work. By noon, the fog had lifted enough to show the land's tired bones. Ethan led the hay horse into the yard, the rope loose, his fingers numb. He spoke Vance, a name offered like a concert on a table between them. Dusty. The word felt right, like the soft ending of a long sentence. The hay horse flicked an ear, considering. Ethan smiled before he realized he had. The conflict pressed in with the sun. Ethan had lit a feed, less money, and a body that remembered how it had been left before. Dusty balked at the fence line, spooked by a crow's harsh laughter, and the rope went taut. For a heartbeat, everything narrowed. Ethan could pull, could prove himself stronger, could repeat the old grammar of control. Instead, he stepped closer, loosened his grip, and waited for the panic to pass. Dusty trembled, then exhaled a long breath that left both of them lighter. They worked the afternoon without triumph. Ethan brushed, stopped, brushed again, learning where the hay horse flinched and where it leaned. He cleaned a shallow cut, his step steady despite the ache in his wrists. Dusty tested him, shifted, took a step away, then returned. Each return was a stitch, mending something neither of them named. When a gust rattled the barn door, Dusty started, and Ethan found himself murmuring nonsense, a low sound meant to fill the space between fear and calm. Third evening, the sky cleared to a hard blue. Ethan led Dusty to the far field, the ground soft from last night's rain. Dusty lowered his head and began to dig, hose scraping, earth yielding. Ethan frowned, but let him be. There was an urgency in the motion, not frantic, but intent, as if the soul were speaking and Dusty understood its language. Ethan felt the pull of curiosity and the weight of his limits. He watched, hands resting on his thighs, a witness again. The digging stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Dusty lifted his head, nostrils flaring, and looked at Ethan, eyes dark and steady. The movement stretched, held by the hush that comes before something breaks or becomes. Ethan stepped forward, heart knocking, and Dusty did not retreat. He pressed his forehead into Ethan's chest, a brief, surprising weight that stole the air from him. Ethan closed his eyes, and the day tipped. When he opened them, the light had softened. The field looked altered, as if a seam had been tugged loose. Ethan left Vance, a sound rusty and real, and Dusty snorted, the corner of his mouth lifting. They stood like that until the chill returned, until the land exhaled its evening. Ethan led Dusty back to the barn, the road forgotten in his hand, and knew with a clarity that felt like tendon without sound, that walking away would now be the hardened choice. Night came with a suddenness that felt earned. Stars stitched themselves into the dark, and the barn settled, ticking and sighing. Ethan mixed what feed he could find, measuring scarcity, deciding anyway. He set the bucket down, stepped back, and Dusty approached without hesitation. The sound of eating filled the space where doubt had lived. Ethan leaned against the post, muscles humming, aware of how close he stood to something like belief. A truck passed on the road, headlights skimming the fence, and Dusty stiffened. Ethan's hand rose and fell, a slow arc meant to say stay. The horse watched the light disappear, then returned to the bucket. Ethan's breath matched Dusty's, an accidental harmony. He caught of the laughter that had followed him the word worthless flung like a verdict, and felt it loosen its grit. Later, as the cold sharpened, Ethan lay on the straw again, coat pulled tight. Dusty shifted, then, with a deliberate care, lowered himself nearby. The ground took the weight. The sound was enormous and intimate. Ethan stared at the rafters, pulse loud in his ears, and understood the risk he was taking by staying. Loss could still come. Hunger could still win. Morning could still undo this fragile peace. Dusty's warmth reached him anyway. Ethan turned on his side, close enough to feel it, not touching, respecting the thin line they had drawn together. The horse breathed, a deep, steady rhythm that invited sleep. Ethan let himself accept the invitation. As he drifted, a final chord rose, clear and starting as a bell. Whatever lay buried in this land, whatever trouble waited beyond the fence, tonight had already given him something he had not known he was allowed to keep, and it refused to let go. Outside, the field held its breath, and somewhere beneath the churned soul, a promise listened, patient and awake, ready to answer the quiet courage of a man who stayed through the coming dawn. Morning returned gently, as if the night had negotiated mercy on Ethan's behalf. Pale sunlight slid through the barn slats and found Dusty first, warming the curve of his shoulder, then crept toward Ethan's face. He woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't his own, deep and even, and for a suspended moment he forgot where he was. Then memory set it in, not as weight, but as presence. Dusty stood already, watching him. Not alert, not wary. Simply aware. Ethan pushed himself upright, jaws stiff, straw clinging to his coat. He expected the familiar ache of regret. The quiet was that usually greeted him at dawn and listed all the reasons he should not be here. It didn't come. Instead, there was only the work waiting to be done and the strange calm that came with knowing exactly where to begin. He moved slowly, careful not to shatter whatever fragile agreement had formed overnight. Dusty followed him without being led, hose soft against the packed earth. Ethan noticed this and felt something shift, subtle but undeniable, like ice cracking far out on a lake. He filled the trough again, checked the cat he'd cleaned the day before. It looked better, less angry. Healing had already begun, quietly, without permission. The ranch revealed itself more clearly in daylight. Fence posts leaned like tired men, the house sagged and in its own history, and the fields stretched out in uneven patches of gold and brown. Worthless, his family had said, dismissing it with practiced ease. Ethan saw something else now, not potential, not promise, but endurance. This land had survived neglect. So had he. Dusty returned to the far field after eating, head low, steps purposeful. Ethan followed at a distance, curiosity tugging at him. The horse reached the same spot as the evening before and began to dig again. Not frantic, focused. Dirt flew in deliberate arcs, the rhythm steady, almost ceremonial. Ethan crouched nearby, fingers brushing the sole. It was softer here, darker, as if it remembered being touched. A thought flickered, something about old habits, enamel sensing water, instinct older than language, but Ethan let it go. He had learned, recently, that not everything needed an explanation to be respected. He watched until Dusty stopped, nostrils flaring, ears forward. They stood there together, listening to a silence that felt charred, like it before rain. The rest of the day unfolded in small, honest struggles. Dusty resisted the halter at first, testing boundaries, stepping away when Ethan stepped closer. Ethan adjusted, retreated, tried again. There was no victory in it, only patience. When the halter finally rested around Dusty's neck without protest, Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with control. It was the satisfaction of being chosen. By afternoon, a figure appeared at the edge of the property, a boy no more than 12, lingering near the fence. He didn't call out or wave. He simply watched. Ethan noticed him only when Dusty did, ears swiveling, attention shifting. Ethan raised a hand in greeting, a gesture that felt older than words. The boy hesitated, then mirrored it before retreating, as if embarrassed by his own courage. The presence lingered after the boy left, an awareness that this place was no longer entirely his. Ethan felt a flicker of unease, quickly followed by something like relief. Isolation had been his shield for too long. He returned to the barn, the rhythm of chores grounding him, Dusty's shadow moving alongside his own as the sun dipped. Dusty started at a sudden nose, a truck backfiring on the distant road. The reaction was swift and sharp, muscles calling, breath quickening. Ethan moved without thinking, placing himself between Dusty and the sound, his own heart pounding. He spoke softly, words meaningless but tone steady. It took longer this time, the fear digging in deeper, but eventually Dusty's breathing slowed. He leaned into Ethan, a brief, heavy contact that left Ethan trembling long after it ended. That night, Ethan cooked a simple meal on a camp stove, the smell of beans and coffee filling the cool air. He ate sitting on the barn step, Dusty nearby, chewing hay. The stars came out one by one, indifferent and beautiful. Ethan thought of the boy at the fence, of the way Dusty had dug with such intent, of the strange sense that something he was stirring awake. He slept less deeply this time, waking often, but each time he woke, Dusty was there. Not guarding, just present. When dawn finally came, it brought with it a certainty that surprised him. He could not leave. Not yet. Whatever this was, this fragile, growing thing, it required his staying. Dusty began digging again just after sunrise, more insistently now. Ethan approached, kneeling beside him, hands sinking into the loosened earth. Something solid lay beneath, resisting his fingers. His breath caught. He glanced at Dusty, who watched him with an intensity that felt almost expectant. Ethan paused, heart racing, the moment stretching thin. He didn't know what he was about to uncover. He only knew that the ground beneath his knees held more than dirt, and that whatever waited there had already changed the course of his life. As he dug deeper, the sound of metal scraped faintly against stone, and the field seemed to lean in, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone to listen. The sound carried farther than it should have, that faint scrape beneath the soil, and it unsettled Ethan more than silence ever had. He stopped digging, palms pressed flat against the earth, as if asking permission. Dusty stood close, shoulder brushing his, steady as a post set deep. The movement felt shared, not owned. Ethan covered the spot again, slowly, deliberately, smoothing the ground until it looked untouched. Whatever lay beneath could wait. Something in him knew that rushing would break the spell. By late morning, the ranch no longer felt empty. The boy returned, this time with a smaller child trailing behind him, both hovering near the fence like birds uncertain of landing. Ethan pretended not to notice at first, focusing on mending a loose board, but Dusty noticed. He always did. The horse lifted his head and walked toward the fence, stopping just short, ears forward, posture open. The children froze, breath held. Ethan finally looked up and nodded, a quiet invitation. They didn't cross the fence. They didn't need to. They stood there, watching Dusty breathe, watching Ethan move around him with careful familiarity. The smaller child smiled first, a sudden unguarded thing, and the older one relaxed, shoulders dropping. No words passed between them. None were required. When they left, it was with backward glances, as if afraid the scene might vanish once unseen. The pattern repeated itself over the next few days. A woman walking her dog slowed at the gate. An old pickup pulled over, its driver sitting behind the wheel longer than necessary. People came close, then closer still, drawn by something they could not name. Ethan felt it too, that pull, like warmth radiating from a fire you hadn't known you were cold without. He kept working, kept feeding and brushing and repairing, letting the days stack gently instead of collapsing. Dusty changed in small ways that mattered. His steps grew surer. The whites of his eyes showed less. He began to seek Ethan out, not constantly, not desperately, but with a quiet confidence that said, "Here is where I stand." Ethan found himself talking to him in fragments, observations, things he had never trusted another person to hold. Dusty listened without flinching, without trying to fix what wasn't broken so much as bruised. One afternoon, a man approached the fence alone. He moved stiffly, favoring one leg, his jacket zipped too high for the warmth of the day. He didn't look at Ethan at first, only at Dusty, his gaze sharp with memory. Ethan felt the shift immediately, the way the air tightens when old pin steps into the room. Dusty stood still, head lowered slightly, an offering. The man didn't speak. He rested his hands on the fence and breathed. Minutes passed. When he finally straightened, his eyes were wet, though his face remained composed. He nodded once at Ethan, a gesture heavy with gratitude, and turned away. Ethan watched him go, just aching with a recognition that started him. This place was becoming a threshold. People arrived carrying things they did not know how to set down, and somehow, without ceremony, they did that evening. Ethan sat in the grass while Dusty grazed nearby. The sun sank low, staining the sky with color that felt almost excessive. Ethan thought of his family then, not with bitterness, but with a distant tenderness, as one might think of a story that no longer belonged to them. He wondered what they would see if they stood where he was now. He wondered if it mattered. The digging resumed at dusk. Dusty returned to the same place, who's working with renewed determination. Ethan stood this time, heart thudding, turned between caution and an urge that felt like destiny's whisper. He knelt again, brushing dirt aside, careful not to strike whatever lay beneath. The ground gave way enough to reveal an edge, dark, straight, and unmistakably man-made. Ethan's breath came shallow. He covered it once more, hands trembling now, and sat back on his heels. A sound reached him then, soft but clear. Footsteps. He turned to see the woman with the dog standing at the fence, watching him watch the ground. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding without language. She didn't ask. He didn't explain. She simply nodded and moved on, as if honoring a boundary she instinctively respected. Night fell fully, stars sharp as pins. Ethan built a small fire near the barn, more for comfort than warmth. Dusty stood close, the glow outlining his shade, turning him almost mythic. Ethan felt the weight of the days pressing together, the sense that he was standing at the edge of a story larger than his own survival. The ranch hummed softly, alive in a way it hadn't been when he arrived. As the fire burned low, Ethan realized the conflict had shifted. It was no longer about whether he could afford to stay or whether the land was worth saving. It was about responsibility. About what happened when something broken became a place of gathering. He had not asked for this role. It had found him anyway. Dusty moved closer, resting his head briefly against Ethan's shoulder. The contact was gentle, grounding. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the movement imprint itself. Tomorrow he would dig again. Tomorrow, whatever lay beneath the soil would begin to surface. But tonight, the ranch held its breath, and Ethan understood, with a clarity that both frightened and steadied him, that this was no longer just his inheritance. It was becoming a promise, and promises, once felt, demanded to be kept. The morning arrived with a thin frost that silvered the grass and made every step sound deliberate. Ethan stood at the barn door longer than usual, hands tucked into his sleeves, watching Dusty breathe clouds into the cold. The ranch felt alert, as if it had slept lightly and woken ready. He sensed it in the way the buds lingered on the fence, in the way the light seemed to pause before fully committing to the day. Dusty moved first, crossing the yard without being asked, stopping near the fence where the children had stood days before. Ethan followed, carrying a bucket, his boots crunching softly. When he set the feed down, Dusty didn't rush it. He waited, head lifted, listening to something beyond the visible. Ethan felt the echo of that attention in his own chest, a tightening that wasn't fear but anticipation. By mid-morning, the boy returned, alone this time. He stood closer than before, fingers wrapped around the wire, eyes fixed on Dusty. Ethan approached slowly, mindful of the distance between them. He stopped a few feet away and knelt, lowering himself to the boy's level without looking directly at him. The silence stretched, fragile and full. Finally, the boy reached out, just enough to brush Dusty's mane through the fence. Dusty didn't move. He accepted the touch like an old truth. The boy smiled, quick and bright, then ran off, leaving the air lighter than it had been. The day warmed, and with it came others. Not crowds. Never crowds. Just people passing by, pausing, staying a little longer than they meant to. Ethan noticed how Dusty adjusted himself to each presence, stepping closer to some, holding distance with others, as if reading stories written beneath the skin. Ethan trusted that instinct more than his own. In the afternoon, the man with the stiff leg returned. This time, he crossed the fence. He moved slowly, as if afraid the ground might object. Ethan met him halfway, offering a nod, nothing more. The man stopped a few paces from Dusty, hands trembling slightly. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. Dusty stepped forward, lowering his head, closing the space with a gentleness that made Ethan's throat tighten. The man rested his forehead against Dusty's neck and closed his eyes. His shoulders shook once, then settled. When he stepped back, something had eased in his face, a line smoothed, a button shifted. He left without a word, but his footsteps were surer. As evening approached, the energy that had been building all day seemed to funnel inward. Dusty returned to the far field, not to dig, but to stand. He planted his hose and waited. Ethan joined him, the two of them facing the low sun. The land stretched out before them, patched and imperfect, but whole in its own stubborn way. Ethan felt a pull then, not toward the buried matter or the mystery beneath the soil, but toward the simple fact of standing here and guarded. He reached out slowly and rested his hand against Dusty's shoulder. The hairs didn't flinch. He leaned into the touch, solid and warm. Ethan closed his eyes. The world narrowed to that contact, to the shared stillness. He felt his breath deepen, his thoughts quiet. For the first time in years, he was not bracing for loss. He was present, the sun slid below the horizon, and the sky burned briefly before cooling to blue. Ethan stayed where he was until the first star appeared. When he finally moved, Dusty followed without prompting. They walked back to the barn together, shadows long and intertwined. That night, Ethan didn't lie awake counting regrets. He slept deeply, the kind of sleep that carries no dreams because it has nothing left to resolve. In the darkness, Dusty stood nearby, a silent sentinel, and the ranch settled around them. Whatever waited beneath the earth could wait a little longer. Something more important had already surfaced, quiet and undeniable, binding them together in a way that felt less like a beginning and more like a remembering. The storm came in without warning, rolling over the plains like a hell breath finally released. By the time Ethan noticed the change in the sky, the light had gone strange, flattened, the colors drained as if the world were bracing itself. Wind pressed through the grass, bending it low, and Dusty lifted his head, ears sharp, body tightening with a focus Ethan had learned to respect. Rain followed hard and fast, cold drops striking the roof of the barn with a metallic insistence. Ethan worked quickly, securing what he could, his hands numb, his thoughts narrowed to the rhythm of preparation. Dusty paced once, then twice, not panicked, but restless in a way that felt purposeful. When the tendon cracked close enough to vibrate the ground, Dusty pulled toward the far field with a strength that startled Ethan. They reached the spot together as the rain began to ease, the storm moving east as abruptly as it had arrived. The earth there had changed. The soil was turned open, the neat covering Ethan had smoothed days before washed away. Mud glistened in the low light, and something dark and angular broke through the surface, undeniable now. Ethan's heart hammered. He knelt, fingers sinking into wet soil, and brushed away the mud with care that bordered on reverence. The metal was old, scarred, its edges softened by time. A corner emerged, then a lid, the outline of a chest that had waited decades for this moment. Dusty stood over him, unmoving, rainwater dripping from his mane, eyes fixed on Ethan with an intensity that felt almost solemn. Tendon rumbled again, farther off, as Ethan dug. Each movement felt heavy with consequence. When the lid finally gave, resisting before yielding with a groan that seemed to come from the ground itself, Ethan froze. He half expected nothing. Or worse, something that would demand more than he had left to give. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and burnt paper, lay history. Gold coins dull but intact. Documents bound with twine. A leather journal swollen with age. Ethan lifted each item slowly, his hands shaking, rain blurring his vision. Names lit out at him, dates etched in careful script, references to land grants, to safe passage, to a ranch that had once been a refuge when the world beyond it had been cruel. He sat back on his heels, breath coming in shallow bursts, the rain cooling his skin. This place had not been forgotten. It had been hidden, protected. The laughter of his family echoed faintly in his memory, hollow now, stripped of its power. Worthless, they had said. The word felt absurd in his mouth. Footsteps squelched behind him. Ethan turned to see the man with the stiff legs standing at the edge of the field, rain plastering his jacket to his frame. Behind him, the woman with the dog hovered, the leash wrapped tight around her wrist. The boss stood farther back, eyes wide, mud streaking his shoes. They hadn't planned this. None of them had. Yet here they were, drawn by the simple. Ethan didn't hide the chest. He couldn't have if he wanted to. He simply looked at them, rain and disbelief on his face, and something passed between them all, a recognition that this was bigger than curiosity, bigger than chance. The man stepped closer, reading one of the documents over Ethan's shoulder. His breath caught. My grandfather talked about this place. The man said quietly, the first words Ethan had ever heard from him. Said it saved people. Said it disappeared. Dusty shifted, hooves firm in the mud, as if anchoring them all. The storm moved on, leaving the air scrubbed clean, the sky opening above them. Sunlight broke through the clouds and struck the cones, igniting them briefly, brilliantly. The effect was almost theatrical, and Ethan felt a lefty free from his chest, half disbelief, half relief. They carried the chest to the barn together, moving carefully, reverently. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. The barn seemed to hold the movement, its old beams creaking softly, as if remembering. Ethan spread the contents out on a table, the papers drying slowly, the journal open to a page marked with a faded ribbon. That night, words spread, not loudly, not recklessly, but the way meaningful things do, through whispers and glances and the unspoken understanding that something important had been uncovered. More people came the next day. Then more after that. Not for the gold. Not even for the history. They came because the ranch had revealed itself, and in doing so had revealed something in them. Ethan stood in the field at dusk, Dusty beside him, watching the lights glow faintly from the barn windows. He felt changed, not by the discovery itself, but by the path that had led to it, the choice to stay, to listen, to trust a wounded animal and a wounded piece of land. The treasure beneath the soul had mattered, yes, but it was not the miracle. Ethan understood now what Dusty had known all along. The ground gives out its secrets only to those willing to stand still long enough to feel where to dig. The days that followed did not erupt into spectacle or noise. They unfolded the way healing often does, incrementally, almost shyly, as if afraid that too much attention might undo it. Morning after morning, Ethan woke to the ranch breathing around him, the land no longer silent but softly alive, its sounds layered with purpose. Dusty greeted each dawn with the same steady presence, his breath rising in pale clouds, his hose pressing certainty into the earth. Ethan expected chaos once the discovery became known. Lawyers, officials, arguments over who deserved what. Some of that came, eventually, but it arrived dulled and distant, stripped of urgency by something far more grounded already taking root. Papers were signed, appraisals were made. Numbers were spoken that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Yet none of it felt central. The barn remained warm. The gates stayed open. People continued to arrive not with demands, but with need. What surprised Ethan most was how little anyone cared about the gold itself. It was acknowledged, respected, and then quietly set aside, like a tool rather than a destination. No one lingered over it. No one asked what he planned to buy. Instead, they asked about Dusty, about the fields, about whether they could sit for a while. The boy came every afternoon now, crossing the fence as if it had always belonged to him. He carried a backpack too big for his shoulders and spread his schoolwork on a crate in the barn, reading aloud when the words tangled in his mouth. Dusty stood nearby, head lowered, listening with an attention that never wavered. When the boy stumbled, Dusty exhaled softly, and the boy tried again. Ethan watched from a distance, pretending to fix hinges that didn't need fixing, his chest tight with a feeling he couldn't yet name. The man with the stiff leg returned too, his visits growing more regular, more confident. He brought coffee in a dented thermos and sat near the paddock, sometimes for hours, hands wrapped around the cup as if it anchored him to the moment. Once, without looking up, he told Ethan he'd slept through the night for the first time in years. He said it quickly, as if afraid the words might disappear if held too long. Ethan nodded, accepting the truth without pressing for more. Dusty wandered over and stood beside the man, close enough to touch, offering presents without expectation. Others followed, van by van, each arrival quiet and announced. A woman whose hand shook until she rested dumb against Dusty's shoulder. A teenager who never lifted his eyes but brushed the horse with careful devotion. A couple who sat together on a fence rail, holding hands in a silence thick with shared loss. No one explained themselves. No one asked to be healed. The ranch seemed to know what to do without being told. Ethan used the money deliberately, almost cautiously, as if afraid of moving too fast. He repaired the fences not to keep people out, but to keep them safe. He fixed the barn roof, reinforcing beams that had held on through decades of neglect. He built a small tech room that doubled as a quiet place to sit when words failed. He hired help from town, paid fairly, listened more than he spoke. Each decision felt less like ownership and more like responsibility, something borrowed rather than possessed. Dusty became the center of it all, not because he demanded attention, but because he offered it freely. He tolerated mistakes. He responded to calm. He retreated gently from force. Around him, people slowed without being asked. Shoulders dropped. Breaths deepened. It was as if his steadiness gave them permission to stop fighting themselves. One afternoon, without ceremony or warning, the boy climbed onto Dusty's back. There were no cameras, no gathered crowd. Ethan stood close, ready to steady either of them, but Dusty stood solid as stone. The boy's laughter burst out suddenly, bright and unguarded, echoing across the field. The sound caught in Ethan's throat. He turned away, pretending to adjust a saddle strap, blinking hard as something inside him finally gave way. Word spread beyond the valley then, not as news, but as invitation. People arrived from neighboring towns, then from farther away, drawn by stories that never sounded impressive when told aloud. A ranch where a horse listens. A place where no one demands explanations. A land that remembers what refuge means. Ethan realized, standing at the edge of the field one evening, that he was no longer reacting to his life. He was shaping it. Not through grand declarations or sudden reinvention, but through repetition. Through staying. Through choosing, again and again, not to abandon what had trusted him first. The laughter of his family no longer echoed in his mind. In its place was the low sound of hooves on earth, of voices softening, of wind moving through grass that had finally been noticed. Ethan rested his hand against Dusty's neck as the sun dipped low, feeling the steady pulse beneath the skin. This was bigger than him now. He could feel it in the way the ranch breathed at dusk, in the way people lingered as if reluctant to return to the knolls beyond the fence. He had inherited land, yes, but what he was building was something far more enduring, a living refuge, shaped by patience, held together by quiet trust, and rooted so deeply that even time would struggle to pull it free. They arrived on a clear afternoon, the kind of day that looked innocent enough to be mistaken for coincidence. 2 cars pulled up near the gate, clean and out of place against the dust and grass. Ethan noticed them before Dusty did, a tightening in his chest warning him even before recognition set in. He did not stop what he was doing. He finished tightening the latch, brushed his hands against his jeans, and turned. His family stepped out slowly, as if the land itself might object to their presence. His older brother first, shoulders squared, sunglasses hiding his eyes. Then his sister, phone already in her hand, gaze flicking from the barn to the fields, calculating. Last came his mother, careful with her steps, her expression caught somewhere between curiosity and disbelief. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with years that had never been unpacked. Ethan felt the old reflex stir, the urge to explain himself, to justify the choice they had marked, to prove that staying had been more than stubbornness. He let the urge pass. Dusty shifted beside him, solid and calm, and Ethan drew Strenna from that quiet wait. They walked the property without asking permission. Their eyes took everything in, the repaired fences, the people scattered across the fields, the boar riding slowly, and in Ethan's watchful eye, the veteran seated near the paddock with his eyes closed, face turned toward the sun. Confusion crept into their movements. This was not the ruin they had imagined. This was not the punchline they had left about. Finally, his brother spoke, was Ed with disbelief. "You didn't tell us any of this." Ethan met his gaze and felt no heat rise in response. "You didn't ask." They stood near the barn then, the old wood holding the space between them. His sister lowered her phone, fingers stilled. "We heard about the chest," she said. "About what was found." Ethan nodded once. He didn't gesture toward it. He didn't need to. The truth was no longer contained in myth or paper. It was walking freely around them, breathing, laughing, resting. Dusty lifted his head and looked at Ethan's mother, eyes gentle and afraid. She started at first, then softened, drawn closer without knowing why. "I thought this place was empty," she said quietly. Ethan followed her gaze across the field, where people moved with unease that hadn't existed before. "It was," he said, "just not in the way we thought." Something shifted then, not dramatically, not all at once, but the sharpness in their posture dulled, replaced by something like humility. They began to see what they had dismissed, not the value of the land, but the cost of leaving it unseen. The laughter that had once followed Ethan he felt suddenly inappropriate, stripped of its certainty. His brother cleared his throat. "You could sell," he said, not forcefully now, more out of habit than conviction. "Make a lot." Ethan looked at Dusty, at the people beyond him, at the barn that no longer felt abandoned. He felt the answer settle in his bones, calm and immovable. "I already have," he said, and smiled gently at their confusion. "Just not in the way you mean." The words landed heavier than any argument could have. No one replied. There was nothing left to contest. His family stayed a while longer, walking slower now, noticing details they would once have overlooked. When they left, it was without conclusions, without demands. Something unresolved lingered behind them, but it no longer belonged to Ethan. As the dust from their cars faded, Ethan exhaled, realizing how little the encounter had shaken him. The old ache was gone. In its place was a grounded certainty, earned rather than claimed. He had not needed their approval to become whole. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the field. Dusty leaned into him, a familiar weight, and Ethan rested his forehead briefly against the horse's neck. He felt it then, fully and unmistakably, the truth he had been circling since the day he stayed the night. He had not been left with nothing. He had been entrusted with something living, something that grew stronger the more it was shared. And as the ranch settled into evening, filled with quiet voices and steady breaths, Ethan understood that this was the moment his life had been bending toward all along. Not the discovery, not the gold, but this, standing exactly where he was meant to stand, no longer trying to be chosen, finally knowing why he had stayed. Years passed without announcing themselves. They moved through the ranch the way seasons do, leaving marks only if you learn how to look. The fences stood straighter now, the barn roof no longer complained in the wind, and the fields wore their scars honestly, grass growing back where it had once been trampled thin. Ethan noticed time moves clearly in the people, in how they arrived, guarded, and left quieter, in how some of them came back again and again until the ranch felt less like a place and more like a rhythm. What had begun as a few hesitant visits became something solid without ever becoming loud. There was no sign at the gate promising miracles. No schedule demanding transformation. The ranch worked because it did not insist. It offered peace, and peace did the rest. Children learned to brush horses before they learned to speak about fear. Veterans slept on benches in the afternoon sun, waking without the short they had carried for years. Parents watched their teenagers laugh at something small and ordinary and felt their chests loosen in surprise.